So last month I annoyed a bunch of Oasis fans with a long piece of content that had nothing to do with remixes whatsoever. For what it's worth, I feel like I dealt with most of their criticisms with grace and panache, but there was one that I didn't get around to responding to. What is this channel? Is it a Blur fan cult? How dare you? I'll have you know I'm much more of a fan of Damon Albarn's main project. Hello everyone and welcome to the R-B-Sides, a music review channel dedicated to reviewing remix albums and EPs. In this video I thought it would be nice to use my recent Britpop baiting content as an excuse to delve into the sprawling backlog of historical remix albums I've been meaning to check out. And today I'm going to be looking at Laika Come Home, the first remix album of the virtual band Gorillaz, aka singer-songwriter Damon Albarn and Tank Girl cartoonist Jamie Hewlett. I've wanted to cover this one for a while as the Gorillaz self-titled album was effectively one of my gateways into the music taste that I have now. Their sound took in aspects of hip-hop, rock, reggae, Latin music, synth-pop and even more, melding it into an experimental yet accessible harvest of ideas. And their influence was such that many subsequent Blur songs even ended up sounding like Gorillaz offcuts. It also may have been why no one was particularly excited to see Blur at that one festival in recent years.
You'll never see us again, so you might as well fucking sing it.
Possibly. Now, you could argue that Laika Come Home isn't the first Gorillaz remix album, given that their first phase also gave birth to the G-Sides collection, which does contain a small handful of alternate versions, but overall it's much more of a B-Sides and rarities compilation than an outright remix album. By contrast, Laika took almost the entire debut album and ran with one of its most prominent genre influences, that being reggae, and in doing so it introduced the world to a remixer supergroup in the form of the Spacemonkeyz, a mysterious trio of producers with various sensory aversions to evil, who didn't exist before this album and then didn't seem to exist after it either. What happened? Well, in this review, we're going to trawl the reaches of deep space to figure out what they did, where they came from, where they went to, and if they eventually found that dog. But first, let's look at an album that was created a little closer to home.
Here you go, get the cool shine.
I think the whole thing about Britpop was that it taught me that it's very difficult in this country to be experimental.
The basic story of why Gorillaz came about is pretty well documented and easy to summarise at this point. Albarn and Hewlett were watching MTV one day, snarking their way through the manufactured crap they were seeing on the station, and thought they could create something better in the world of pop. The full story of how 2D, Noodle, Russell and Murdoch got together is much more complicated and outside the scope of this video. But if you're more into the lore of Gorillaz, then there's quite a few videos out there that'll give you a decent summary. For me though, it turned out that desire to make pop music more interesting and imaginative is what initially hooked me back in 2001. A few months ago I did a video on Boards of Canada, and of the many interview clips that I sifted through for that video, the one that really stood out to me was when they said, "When we listen to pop music we hear things we want it to do, but it never does them. So we try to make our tracks sound kind of pop so that we can do something really surprising with the melody or whatever." Reading this kind of helped me to realise that despite what my 18-year-old self thought, I do like pop music as a concept, but I always wanted it to be a little bit weirder, and so a band like Gorillaz was very good for scratching that itch. Although my first experience of their music gave no indication of that whatsoever, as I first heard them through BBC Radio 1. Their playlist ultimately favoured the UK garage remix of the song by Ed Case, given that the genre was still then having its moment in the sun. Listening back to it now, I wouldn't say that it's the most inventive slab of two-step I've ever heard, but it's a fun one that maintains the cartoony menace of the original.
I'm feeling glad I got sunshine in a bag. I'm useless, but not for long. The future is coming on.
It keeps a couple of key moments, including the reggae chords and 2D's chorus, which has been sped up to a degree that now kind of sounds a bit ridiculous. But ultimately it's the new vocals from Sweetie Irie that sell it, giving it this playful gravitas that, whilst not quite as distinctive as Dell's vocals, still carries a lot of character.
Feel my motion. Music is from the street, designed to make you move your feet.
Overall though, it does seem like Radio 1 didn't really know what to do with that first Gorillaz album, because when it came to the second single, 192000, they went with the remix of that one as well.
There's a monkey in the jungle, watching a paper trail.
And with this one, they don't even have the excuse of contemporary trends to fall back on. I don't remember the sound of UK pop in 2001 that extensively, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't Screamadelica. Anyway, eventually I borrowed the full album off my cousin to try and learn what this cartoon band was actually about. And a couple of tracks into my first listen, I remember exactly what my first thought was. God, this sounds a bit like Blur.
My job for me. My job make no sound.
Yeah, I didn't realise it was an all-barn project at the time. No one had told me. And yet the decision to lead in with two of the album's most rock tracks does strike me as deliberate. Kind of like a cushion for any Britpop fans sticking their head in to help them digest this new direction.
It's the drugstore soul boy, over the top with the sweetest inspiration.
You have album opener Rehash that has this kind of smoky folk quality you'd hear on tracks like Coffee and TV, but with more of a hip-hop style breakbeat like There's No Other Way. Following that you've got 5-4, part of a long tradition of songs named after its own time signature. There are a couple of other big rock moments elsewhere in the track list. Punk is probably the most distinctive, bringing over the anarchic silliness you'd get from the likes of Song 2. Although to me it's always sounded like David Bowie's Queen Bitch if he was a lot more pleased with himself. The other big rock moment is the closing track M1A1, which is about as big a finish as you can get for an album that's more focused on micro-production details. Starts with a long brooding bass line with horror synths and samples of Day of the Dead. All of which eventually give way to this gnarly, detuned post-punk rattler. These tracks are decent and definitely add flavour to the record, but it's the third track that really introduces the new territory of this band. Tomorrow Comes Today.
Stereo, I want it all. It's taking me far too long.
For me, this was my first favourite from the album and one that I still really enjoy today. It's got all these great contradictory production styles to them. It's got the gentleness of trip-hop, the muscle of hip-hop, the fullness of rock, and the emptiness of dub reggae. The following track, New Genius Brother, continues with this theme, starting off sounding like it's going to be a trip-hop version of the theme tune from DuckTales. Every day they're out there making DuckTales. But it resolves into being this lovely, rainy piece of hip-hop infused blues that also harnesses the power of the melodica and some strings.
Brother, sister, too, do what you must do.
On the trip-hop front, Soundcheck Gravity is the album's most Portishead moment with its mixture of strings and scratches, although I'd say it's more focused on atmosphere than drama.
Don't pull me down. Don't pull me down on me.
As is the album's only instrumental track, Double Bass, which has this transfixing 12-bar pattern that manages to keep the track engaging despite being built around little more than a brooding bass line and some cheeky organ soloing. I mean, I say instrumental, it does have that one line.
All of which makes me anxious, at times unbearably so.
And this track wouldn't be anywhere near as essential without it. But the song that announced them to the world was a culmination of many of these ideas in the form of the spaghetti western homage, Clint Eastwood. The original version.
Feeling sensations that you thought was dead. No squealing, remember.
And at this point I should talk about the factor that keeps me coming back to this album, which is the production of Dan the Automator. Albarn notes that the ideas for the album were about 75% there before they brought Dan on board, and assuming that's true, then the remaining 25% must have been crucial, because you can hear his fingerprints all over this album. His presence in underground hip-hop in the 90s definitely can't be understated, helping bolster the rhymes of Del the Funky Homo Sapien, Prince Paul and Kool Keith. And many trademarks of those productions find their way in here. Hell, you could make an argument that New Genius is basically just Dr. Octagon's Blue Flowers from the patient's point of view.
Blue flowers, draining green. About the pond, blue flowers. Don't trust people you meet.
Well, musically at least. But even though Automator is from a hip-hop production background, he's frequently dipped his toes into the world of rock over the years. Hell, he's pretty much dipped his whole legs in at this point. But then there's also projects like Lovage, actively using his production as a vehicle for two contrasting rock vocalists in the form of Mike Patton and Jennifer Charles, and his production chops are flexible enough to pull it off. And in the case of Gorillaz, even with the more esoteric stuff on this album, the production just sells it. The original 19-2000 is probably one of the tracks on this album it took me the longest to learn to enjoy, mainly due to an affliction I would describe as miserable bastard syndrome. It's got a beat that purrs, bleeps and thumps at the same time, and that's a combination it took me a while to get my head around.
Get the cool.
There's also something very overtly childlike about the chorus, thanks to the background la-la-las from Tina Weymouth of the Tom Tom Club. And of course the shoeshine sales pitch from Miho Hattori, the vocalist from Chibo Matto, a group who had their own similarly forward-thinking trip-hop tendencies.
I'm riding on a camel.
Miho does backing vocals on a couple of other tracks as well, having been introduced to Albarn by Dan the Automator, and given how much Gorillaz have become known for having an uncle-sized Rolodex of famous guest stars, the cast list is actually pretty modest on this first album, with Del the Funky Homo Sapien being the biggest draw thanks to the singles Clint Eastwood and Rock the House. And with Clint Eastwood, Del apparently wasn't even that interested in doing it, given that the song had already been finished with vocals from Feel Life Cypher, although Automator managed to convince him he could bang out something better in half an hour. And he does seem to have been pretty happy to be associated with both of his Gorillaz songs over the years, joining the band on stage on numerous occasions, although he probably wishes someone hadn't let him out of his cage that one time. And then you've got Cuban crooner Ibrahim Ferrer on Latin Simone, an addition that may be a little jarring on first listen, and yeah, I've come to enjoy all the same. There are some aspects of this album I'm less keen on, mainly the moments where Albarn's falsetto kinda outstays its welcome. Like, I love the dub blues production of Starshine, which is the only non-Automator track as far as I understand, but 2D's croaky yelp does make it a little harder to digest at times. And even more so on Man Research Clapper, in which the fraught yeah yeah yeahs make the outro seem like it goes on forever. Despite that though, this is still my favourite Gorillaz album overall. A lot of people praise Plastic Beach as being the band's apex, but for me the production just didn't quite have the same gravitas as it did under Automator, or even under Danger Mouse on the Demon Days album. For me, the spiky intersection of genres on this project is what makes the first album really come off, and one of the key genres in question is reggae. I've previously expressed my feelings about what happened to reggae in the mainstream in the Bob Marley video that I did, but I feel the self-titled Gorillaz album deserves some credit for trying to keep the genre visible in pop music, even if it's through loose elements rather than the overall sound. For example, you've got the repeated use of melodica throughout, as well as the many bass lines provided by reggae stalwart Junior Dan. You've got the slow strutting rhythmic chords of Clint Eastwood, which Albarn apparently went to great pains to create.
The Rock 1 preset.
Then you've got the beat on one of my favourite tracks, Slow Country, a wonderfully truncated sample from Ghost Town by the Specials that takes some of the track's opening wind and brings it into a vibe I can only describe as a hip-hop version of Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day.
Can't stand your loneliness. Can't stand your loneliness.
The beat on Man Research sounds like a reggae version of Pong. And Starshine also has a strong dub influence with its echoing chords. And if we include G-sides, there's Dracula, which seems to be the most balls-out reggae song they ever did. So, given that there's plenty of reggae influence on this album already, how much more reggae does this album need to be? If you're looking for someone to do a dub remix of your album in 2002, there were plenty of old hands still doing the rounds. You had Adrian Sherwood, Lee Scratch Perry, Scientist, Mad Professor, Dennis Bovell, and Bill Laswell still being active around that time. And yet for Laika Come Home, Albarn decided to go in a different direction. In order to match this cartoon manufactured band that they created, it seems like Gorillaz ended up creating the world's first ever manufactured remix troupe. It's sad to think that there was actually a time when Gorillaz would have their guest stars and even their remixers animated, and then one album later they just got fed up and started sticking a camera in their collaborators' faces. Admittedly, the idea of animated monkeys in space seems a lot less appealing now in the post-NFT age. So, who are the Spacemonkeyz? Let's look at their histories and see what extensive reggae experience they can bring to the table. First up, we have Darren Galea playing the part of See No Evil. Galea is also known as DJ Desire, and he is a core member of the famous reggae band Jamiroquai. Didn't even know Jamiroquai had or needed a DJ. Never heard anyone say their favourite part of Space Cowboy is the scratches. But who cares, we all do low rent jobs for money on our gap year, right? It's Desire's original productions we're interested in, and he did produce a few hip hop records in the early 90s with a rapper named JC001. Clearly getting in there long before the internet was awash with other JCs, very smart. Their main collaborative monument is 1993's Ride the Break, which is largely absent online apart from a couple of music videos, so I had to get a CD copy on Discogs to get the full experience. Pretty sure the guy charged me more than £1 for this, but hey ho. This album's not too bad. The production is clearly operating in the post-De La Soul era, where people are just layering samples on top of each other from all sorts. Some interesting beats on this album, particularly on Air of Despair, which is kind of like what hip-hop might sound like if the Haxan Cloak produced it.
So now you know the chip upon my shoulder becoming the great big boulder, built and donated by all of you. Admit it, no bullshitting, it is true. The entire world's got two faces and I find.
For me, the Achilles heel on this album is JC's rapping, which sounds, for want of a better phrase, very early 90s. He's clearly going for conscious lyrical content here, but then his choruses will often hit you with stuff like, well, it's still classier than Blurred Lines. Might as well have just got some kid to come on and go. On this track, Cupid, though, you can hear that there is a reggae beat. It's actually a big sample from Double Barrel by Dave and Ansel Collins, which is the second reggae track to ever hit the #1 spot in the UK charts. One other track has a significant reggae vibe to it, that being the opening track Never Again. This time it's a sample of... oh, hey look, it's Ghost Town again. So yeah, our first Spacemonkeyz reggae CV is pretty much limited to sampling other reggae songs, and pretty big ones as well. This doesn't immediately bode well for the album. Second member of the trio is Gavin Dodds, aka Hear No Evil. His Space Monkey handle is Gava, and his main reggae experience is from the band.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gavin Dodds.
Okay, well, at least these two know each other. But again, that's a side gig. Dodds' real project is a duo called Samuel Purdy that he formed with fellow Brightonian Barney Hurley. Let's have a listen to one of their biggest songs.
You know that love keeps taking us.
Oh, for God's sake. Okay, so it's a Jamiroquai tribute act. They actually called their album Musically Adrift as well to suggest that they were the right band for the wrong time, and that Britpop actually pushed them out of favour. No, I think you're actually just 20 years late. Does Gava have any reggae credits of note? Well, he did contribute to a remix of a band called Dub War. Here's the original. Kind of feel like this might be one of those bands whose name overstates their relationship to reggae, much like Dub Trio or N-Dubs. Gava contributed guitar to the Jazzed remix of this song, so let's check this out.
In your front end, in your back up, they don't care, they ain't got no mercy. Compassion, bloodthirsty.
Guess this is alright in a later Public Enemy kind of way. But we're 2 Spacemonkeyz down now and still no significant reggae credits, which is a little alarming. Third member of the Spacemonkeyz is Richie Stevens, Speak No Evil. Please tell me this guy's got some background in reggae. Stevens is a drummer who produces under the alias Dubversive. Okay, that's promising. Come on, you gotta give me something to work with here.
Oh yeah, scaring the nation.
Yes! Now we're talking. Actual bona fide dubmeister. Phew!
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this guy seems to have the most extensive reggae CV out of all of them, having joined Dennis Bovel's band when he was very young. He's also worked with a whole spectrum of artists in pop, from George Clinton and Jimmy Somerville to Tina Turner and Simply Red. And he did a few dub albums under the name Drumhead, which, once again, had to purchase this CD via Discogs. Mostly just a solid digidub album, not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but there's some good stuff on there. So, a bit of a strange assortment of producers to deliver a full dub overhaul of Gorillaz, but they at least have one seasoned dub specialist in their midst in the form of Dubversive. And yet, as the official story goes, it's actually Desire and Gava who made the first reggae remix for Gorillaz that led Albarn to commission a full-length rework. Now, the first of Laika Come Home's tracks that saw the light of day was the album's third track, Bañana Baby. This came out on the single release of Tomorrow Comes Today, where it was titled Tomorrow Dub. And I have to say, this remix has always been a favourite of mine. It starts really gently with just a bleep pulse and the original piano. But the slow build-up is so lovely on this. It gradually introduces the half-speed drums, the somewhat staccato rhythm piano, some teasing moments of the original vocal with some slowed reverbed harmonies. There's then a breakdown with the melodica as a solo, and the second half of the track kicks in its full reggae glory. Now, this is an interesting concept for a remix here because it's not just a straight up dub of the original elements. If you look at Mad Professor's dubs of Massive Attack, for example, those were basically created using just the original stems, bringing them in and out, adding effects. As the old dub adage goes, it's effectively about using the mixing desk as an instrument. Whereas with these Spacemonkeyz remixes, they're adding additional instruments in order to actually make the song into a reggae song, before they then apply the studio trickery. This isn't the first album of this style I've covered. Last year you had Adrian Sherwood's overhaul of Panda Bear and Sonic Boom's album Reset, in which Sherwood brought in a whole bunch of tried and tested on-new sound musicians to help him reinvent the songs. But Sherwood is an absolute veteran of reggae. He's produced many reggae albums and he's also done dub versions of many albums. Whereas the Spacemonkeyz, though not without experience, are certainly newbies as a unit. Nonetheless, in Bañana Baby, the new reggae elements are pretty solid. You've got these reggae organs, a new bass line, and chiefly a horn section arranged by frequent All-Barn collaborator Mike Smith. And these horns are just gorge. It's really lush how they turn what's effectively a moody middle-of-the-night song into a bleary-eyed Saturday morning elixir of life. If I could level one criticism at this remix, it's that it's maybe a little muted overall. This kind of live stream of dub that the Spacemonkeyz create means that a lot of the elements of the track are bashfully bubbling under the surface, and feels like maybe one extra element should be given room to peek its head above the parapet alongside the horns. But this is one of the first Laika remixes to be released, so maybe it's by design that they went with one of the gentler reworks, just to slowly get people used to the idea. People have assumed over the years that this is the initial remix that Desire did to sell All-Barn on the project.
The official party line is that Darren remixed Tomorrow Comes Today for Damon. Damon said, why don't you do this to the whole album? Then he hooks up with you. Is this all correct so far?
It's almost. He did a remix of 2000. He did Jungle Fresh, not Tomorrow Comes Today. So he'd done that. He'd done that with his fellow cohort from Jamiroquai, which is Gava. I got on with Tomorrow Comes Today at home then.
The world is spinning too fast. I'm bonded like his shoes to keep myself.
This is the one that Desire initially created with Gava, and you can hear quite a different vision for the album in this one. It's still a reggaeification of the original track, but this time the vibe has been changed completely. It's a much slower tempo and the reggae influence is much more overt, to the point where it just sounds like they created a brand new reggae song from scratch and then shoehorned the original vocals in. In fact, you can almost hear a bit of digital time stretch in just how much the vocals have been altered here, and it's a bit uncanny valley. For what it's worth, the composition is actually pretty solid. It starts with a muted brass section a la Bañana Baby before it then comes out of its shell a bit later in the track, seeming like it's about to go into Glenn Miller at any moment. But in fact, surprise, it was the first call bugle melody all along. Sure, you've all heard this before, possibly in the Navy or from some dickhead's car horn. It's also structured quite differently to Bañana Baby in that the first 2/3 of it are quite full on, and then there's a minute and a half of dub spaciousness to round things off with some enjoyable purring bass and a bit of cowbell. It's a perfectly serviceable reggae track, it just doesn't feel like 192000 is the song that should have been shoved into it. This track doesn't work anywhere near as well as Bañana Baby does for me, and as such the disjuncture between these two styles is kind of my fundamental issue with this album. In terms of the collaborative process of the three Spacemonkeyz, Dubversive outlined it as follows.
Darren, being a DJ, was the real arbiter of taste to give it a kind of a modern edge. I was kind of like a one-man rhythm section with a few bass players added in, Stuart Zender, etc. And Gavin was the more the melodic side of things, you know, being a guitarist.
He also points out that Desire's artistic vision was to avoid leaning on the original melodies from the songs, which is something that Dubversive seemed less comfortable with.
You know, I'd say, what are you talking about? You know, that's what the bit everyone knows is go exactly. So we won't use that bit.
But according to him, the working process was pretty egalitarian. And yet you can definitely hear that different tracks on this album have different emphases. You've got the Jungle Freshes that are effectively brand new reggae compositions with just tiny bits of the original in them. Then you've got the Banana Babies, which are essentially dubbed out versions of the original. Everything else on the album sits somewhere between these two styles. Although in fairness, there's only one other track that is as much of a departure from the original as Jungle Fresh, and that's Depunked, the remix of Punk. It's got fragments of 2D shouty vocals and some of the guitar noise from the original, but mostly it's a departure. In fact, it's almost a subversion, as at one point it goes into this shopping channel marimba. Which sonically is pretty much the opposite of punk rock. Dubversive mentioned that this was one of the harder ones to turn into reggae, and in their initial assessment of how to do the project, they realised they were only going to have the mental fortitude to tackle some of the more difficult tracks, which is why they deliberately omitted 3 tracks from the Laika sessions: Rock the House, Latin Simone and Double Bass. Which is maybe a little disappointing, but honestly, if it was going to result in remixes like this that had scant interest in grappling with the originals, then I kind of think that's for the best. When it comes to the more dubby versions on this album, you've got Soundcheck Gravity, titled Crooked Dub, which sticks pretty closely to the original structure, even keeping the croaky folk breakdowns of the original largely intact, albeit with a little bit more delay. Where it diverges is in giving a much more driving beat that has a slight dancehall strut to it and a Richter scale troubling bass line that almost gives off some Sabres of Paradise vibes. Just like Banana Baby, this one works really well with how it plays with the expectations from the original song, removing elements from when you think they'll appear and bringing them back in when you get used to them not being there. Also, like Banana Baby, it maybe runs its course a little earlier than its runtime, which, to be honest, is a common complaint with tracks on this album. And I do kind of wish there'd been even a tiny bit of use of the Kid Koala scratches from the original. But still think this is a really strong version overall. As is the remix of Man Research Clapper, here titled Monkey Racket, which for me offers probably the biggest improvement on the original source material. The verses on this one replace the vocals with a melodica replication of the melody. And this really helps the track as it makes 2D's falsetto less grating when it finally arrives in the chorus. The switching of the beats is a really nice touch in this as well. You've got this measured half-speed reggae rhythm in the verses, and then it flits to this hip-hop skip in the choruses that reminds me a lot of Q-Tip's Breathe and Stop. It even adds a bit of rhythm guitar towards the end to double down on that Q-Tip feel. And it's interesting how, given how reggae adjacent the original beat is on this track, this remix just completely rejects it. Their remix of Starshine, Dub 09, also rejects the original's reggae elements, although I'd say the rejection is a little too strong on this one. It goes from the modest metronome of the original beat to this giant stomp that creates shockwaves every time it lands. It has a weighty bass line to prop it up, but the problem is the melodic elements of this one sound kind of flimsy in comparison, given that it's 2D's most anemic performance on the album. It also doesn't help that the original guitar has been EQ'd to sound like it's just gurgling in the background. La 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 la. There's a brass section that does help to give this one a bit more ballast, but it feels like there's too much of a contradiction in the top and bottom ends of this one. A more successful re-reggaeing happens on A Fistful of Peanuts, which is a remix of the original's lead single, Clint Eastwood. Dubversive notes that they made a real effort to go in a different direction with this remix, as they felt the Ed Case remix had already laid claim to the chorus and organ from that track.
And we didn't want to crawl up their posterior with, a repetition. And also don't forget, what a classic remix is. Take the hook, do a new groove, and there's your remix. So,
right.
But this was like, no, avoid the hook, completely rewrite it, and then just put a little snippet in so you go, oh my god, it's that track.
Which is probably overly courteous considering how many remixers don't give a shit about that sort of thing. Oh, you used the original vocal for your Smack My Bitch Up remix, so I'd better not do that then. And so with this, they rebuild it into a more traditional slick reggae groove, once again with some speaker troubling bass and a shimmering organ. There's hardly any 2D here and no Del whatsoever, so they actually let the melodica become the focal point of the track. And it works really nicely as a palate cleansing surrogate chorus, giving some release after the tension of the other elements. And the vocal duties are largely handed over to a couple of reggae mainstays in the form of Earl 16 and U Brown, whose respective crooning and toasting seeps into the track throughout. They do give a sumptuous alternate vibe to the song, even if I do feel like the way they're deployed is a little bit ramshackle. With U Brown, meanwhile, his main showcase is on the album's second track, Strictly Rubbadub. This one takes the original melodic elements of slow country and slots them into a much beefier framework with a smattering of 2D on it. The jauntiness of the piano and those chords fit in stunningly well into the reggae framework, and there's a bunch of new vocal sections here by U Brown with his affirming high energy toasting across the track. But it's another instance of a remix struggling to decide whether it's a reggae song or a dub version. And so it keeps switching between instrumental sections, bits of 2D's vocal, bits of U Brown's vocal, and it just refuses to settle on what exactly this remix is. There's actually a bonus version of this remix snuck on at the end as a hidden track called More Rubbadub, where they just keep U Brown's toasting in uninterrupted for the vast majority of the track, and he eats this beat alive. But yeah, as a backing track for some dancehall chatter, this remix really comes to life in this form, and I kind of wish they'd been brave enough to put this version right up front in the track list rather than tucking it away in the secret track section. As for my money, this is one of the strongest realizations on the album just by not worrying about where 2D fits into all of it. There's also a more fully vocaled up version of A Fistful of Peanuts in the hidden track section, this time titled More Peanuts.
What's the song about? Bad peanuts!
For me, this one's a little less successful, as Earl 16's croons aren't as combative as U Brown, so they sound a little bit buried in the pile-up of production here, but they're still a pleasantly ebbing presence throughout. In terms of the rest of the album, it's a bit of a mixed bag. You've got Mutant Genius, which alongside Monkey Racket is probably the most experimental take here. The full vocal refrain of the original New Genius is kept intact, but the beat has been changed to this supple digidub package that once again adds a smattering more joy to the pop. Got all these odd little background details as well, like this theremin sounding spoopy ghost sound and the scream of someone who's presumably running away from them. And there's a very strange little thumb piano sound in a couple of the breakdowns. definitely got the most unique sound palette on the record, and even though it's once again a little overloaded and a little too long, I'd consider this fairly solid. The following track, Come Again, which is a rehash of Rehash, also has some unusual percussive elements to it, sounding like rain on a tin roof at the beginning, and only gradually unfolding its elements to show where the kick and snare actually belong.
Stop.
This remix is an interesting chimera of the production styles on this album, as it starts off fairly faithful to the original with the snippets of the bass and the guitar, but about a quarter in we go into the rhythm piano and the reggae vibes take over. And actually, this is probably the most successful attempt to bridge the gap between the opposing visions of this album, as it's probably the track that has the best balance of the original elements and the new composition. The remaining two remixes of the original's rock tracks favour more of a ska feel to them, which, honestly, I kind of wish they'd applied to Depunked. Maybe there was a fear of accidentally channeling Real Big Fish in the process or something, I don't know. You've got the remix of 5/4, wonderfully titled P45, which goes for this repetitive ska rhythm, seemingly to try and dance around the unusual time signature of the original vocals. And it kind of succeeds, but it does feel like a bit of a cop-out. The resultant monotony also creates some strange discord as far as the melody goes. There's some bits here that just don't even seem like they're sure what key it's in. There are a few fun moments in this one, like the rhythm switch at the beginning and the way the brass builds during the breakdown halfway through. But this one just doesn't quite come together for me, and even though it's one of the shortest tracks on the album, the minimalism makes it feel just as long as some of the others. And then, to close the album, ignoring the bonus tracks of course, you have Lil Dub Chefin, the rework of the original's closer M1A1. And this track in particular is why I would have liked to hear a ska version of Punk, because the bass song here transfers remarkably well to the new composition. It's got the raucous spirit of the original, but it's now much more melodic and much more to the point. It's also got the late Yob of Doom Terry Hall assisting on vocal duties, which gives it much more of a group sing-along feel, especially on the La 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 Hey. If you were going to release any of the tracks from this album as a standalone single, and they did, then it makes sense that this is the one they chose. The only real problem with this one is that the vocal section of the song is finished by 1 minute 30 and most of the rest of the track is instrumental. And not in a particularly inventive way like other tracks in this album are, it just feels like they're playing to fill time and throwing in a few dub effects here and there just to try and keep things ticking over. Eventually though, the track ends with one more passage of vocals, giving the track a bespoke sign-off. And so the Spacemonkeyz are officially indoctrinated into the Gorillaz world. Although if you do want to know more about their place in said universe, it's worth checking out the B-side of the Lil Dub Chefin single titled Spacemonkeyz Theme. Though I'll be honest, for me this track raises more questions than it answers, especially musically.
Let us break the hold and escape the mind. This is the way we go into the great divide.
There is barely any reggae in this at all, bar an ever so slight fragment of brass that surfaces here and there in the track. What you get instead is an elaborate piece of sci-fi hip-hop over which the rapper Last Emperor outlines significant portions of the Spacemonkeyz backstory. And as if that wasn't enough of a lore dump, there's also some Chinese vocals from Stanley Huang from the LA Boys. I mean, it fits with the original Gorillaz vibe, even if the production feels somewhat rougher than their usual fare. It's just weird for me that the moment they end up doing a B-side for the one single from Laika, they ditch pretty much all pretense of being a reggae group. Almost as if they're saying, this is really what we're about. The reggae stuff was just a front to get our foot in the door. And so, for most people, that's where the existence of the Spacemonkeyz ends. I feel like I'm about to go into Todd in the Shadows territory, given that I've effectively done a kind of one-hit Wonderland style assessment of the Spacemonkeyz only album, but you know what? Sod it. A few more Spacemonkeyz remixes have surfaced in obscure places over the years. The same year as Laika, they also did a remix for one of the all-time best-selling artists in Germany, Herbert Grönemeyer. The original track, Mensch, is kind of what happens when you take 80s adult contemporary and match it up to 90s hip-hop. Maybe it's more of a breath of fresh air in Germany, I don't know. The Spacemonkeyz remix of it, however, yeah, it doesn't work at all. Damon Albarn's vocals worked in reggae due to his swagger and cartoony falsetto. With Grönemeyer, however, it just sounds like a bad homage to Men at Work's Down Under. Some years later, they did a remix for obscure trip-hop group Virgin Souls, specifically a track called Snakes and Ladders, which I believe is no relation to the unreleased Gorillaz track of the same name.
It's getting away from me. It's snakes and ladders every day.
This original just sounds like a Poundland Portishead. It's kind of dreary and fairly thin in production. But the Spacemonkeyz remix very much breathes some life into it, making the whole thing squishier, murkier, and much more engaging. Sadly, it never really got much exposure, as it only appeared on Spacemonkeyz' MySpace page, which is no longer a thing. Although it has at least had more exposure than a remix Dubversive mentions that the group did for Plan B, which apparently his record label didn't see fit to release. The one other remix under the Spacemonkeyz name happened a couple of years ago for a Richie Stephens project titled The Smudge All-Stars. This was basically a guest-heavy attempt at bringing back some of the old P-Funk sound. I feel like this is the sort of song you write when you're too scared to see a doctor. This track, Freaky Toe, gets the Spacemonkeyz touch from Dubversive and Desire, but to be honest, you wouldn't know it was a Spacemonkeyz remix, given that they've pretty much ditched the reggae entirely for this one. It just feels like they've gently rubbed some reverb on it, and compared to the original, I think it's kind of lacking a spark. Weirdly, there is a dub reggae remix by Desire and Dubversive on another smudge track, Our Lives, but they didn't use the Spacemonkeyz alias for this one. Very curious. And as far as their remix work under this collective name goes, that's pretty much it. In his interview with Hallelujah Monkeyz 7 years ago, Dubversive mentions that they were working on a Spacemonkeyz artist album, but due to how busy they all were, it had kept falling by the wayside.
A remix project, by its very nature, is reworking someone else's stuff. So it's not your whole, raison d'etre.
I do not approve of this sentiment.
So actually doing the completely original project is a longer term process to develop.
In the middle of last year, though, Stephens did release the first ever Spacemonkeyz solo track, Honest Racket. It's actually credited to Spacemonkeyz Dubversive Richie Stephens, which does seem like a bit of an attempt to get several aliases into one all-purpose SEO, which is only something you can really do if you don't have a huge backlog of aliases to your name. As a track though, this is a solid bit of industrial dub, albeit a lot darker than much of the previous Spacemonkeyz stuff. I like this, and I genuinely hope this points to more Spacemonkeyz material to come. In the meantime, however, the sole album-length encapsulation of this group's work is still Laika Come Home. Originally at this point I flippantly said no, but that feels kinda mean, so I took it out. There's a reason why Todd's format works for one-hit wonders and not one-off remix projects. As remix albums go though, this is definitely an interesting one. It's probably one of the last proper attempts from a UK group at putting a credible reggae album into the mainstream, and it's an album that definitely seems to have its place for Gorillaz fans, particularly those with as much interest in the lore as in the music. But in the wider sphere, this doesn't seem to have been remembered quite as affectionately. And if I was to theorise why, artistically it suffers a little from a lack of overarching vision when it comes to how the reggaeification is meant to work with the original elements. The album constantly flits between wanting to provide dub reworks of the original source material and wanting to create brand new reggae compositions from scratch, and yet, bearing in mind that Spacemonkeyz didn't even exist as a group before this album, this is nonetheless an alarmingly competent and inventive attempt at a reggae album. I joked earlier about 2/3 of Spacemonkeyz being from Jamiroquai, but this doesn't come across as a My First Reggae album by any stretch. It definitely feels like an album by a trio of producers who know and respect the form. In terms of my favourite remix, I'm definitely inclined towards the dubbier tracks on the album, and even though it's the first one I ever heard, I'd give an honourable mention to Bañana Baby, as all these years on I still think this is a gorgeous reinvention of Tomorrow Comes Today. But ultimately I've got to give the nod to one of the hidden tracks on this one, the more Rubbadub version of Slow Country, which I think is a revelation. It's just outstanding work from Hugh Brown in basically just running roughshod over everything Spacemonkeyz throw at him production wise. Least favourite remix, there's a small handful of contenders for this. I think both P45 and Dub 09 are the tracks that suffer the most from particularly irritating production decisions, so I feel like those have the most squandered potential out of everything here. But to be honest, my least favourite track is the album's opener, the project's proof of concept, Jungle Fresh. I'm glad it was created, as without it we wouldn't have got any of the really good remixes of this project, but out of everything here, it's the one that sounds the most generic in reggae terms, and I just don't really like the way the vocals are deployed. And is this collection of remixes better than the original? Partly. The three that I think top the originals are the remixes of Man Research, New Genius and M1A1. I think all of these offer more precise takes on the original tracks that bring out the best in them and play down their weaknesses. I'd also put a couple of tracks on par with the originals, as I think Bañana Baby is just as wonderful as Tomorrow Comes Today, and More Rubbadub is a really surprising contender for me given how much I love Slow Country, but honestly, it's really well deserved. So that is my review of Remixing's first manufactured boy band. Do you agree with my assessments, disagree with them, no opinion on them? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Please do subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more remix based content, and if you have any suggestions for other remix albums you'd like me to cover in future, I'm well up for hearing them. Thank you for watching, this video is over.